Welcome. My name is Paul Googe. I work as a Regulatory Counsel in the Office of Medical Policy in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the Food and Drug Administration. Today, I'll be talking about a new draft guidance that was recently released entitled Sponsor Responsibilities, Safety Reporting Requirements, and Safety Assessment for IND and Bioavailability Bioequivalence Studies. We're looking for your feedback on this draft guidance. At the end of this presentation, I'll provide more information about how to submit comments. I'm excited to introduce the new draft guidance to you today. Here are the key areas that we'll take a look at. Before getting into the specifics of the draft guidance, we'll work through the background behind IND safety reporting. To do so, we'll start by providing a brief overview of the 2010 IND safety rule and of the previous guidances in this space. We'll talk a bit about how these guidances have changed over time to better address concerns within the industry. Next, we'll highlight some overall concepts and reporting requirements found in the 2010 IND safety rule. Finally, we'll shift the main focus of this webinar, the new draft guidance about sponsor responsibilities. Our introduction to the new draft guidance will not be comprehensive. This webinar will not stand alone, but must be supplemented by reading the guidance. That being said, the webinar will point out key differences found in the new draft guidance and previous guidances, and will also give a brief overview of the content of the guidance. The 2010 rule codified the requirements of sponsors conducting clinical trials under IND to report certain safety signals to FDA during the course of drug development. After the final rule, FDA published and later finalized a guidance for industry and investigators entitled Safety Reporting Requirements for INDs and BA/BE Studies. This guidance is one that many of you are already familiar with, and it is still the final guidance detailing FDA's thinking about IND safety reporting. Since 2012, however, FDA has worked to address industry concerns. Specifically, FDA has sought to provide more guidance regarding aggregate reporting, unblinding, and safety assessment. In 2015, FDA published the follow-on draft guidance entitled Safety Assessment for IND Safety Reporting. FDA has continued to listen to industry concerns on this topic and received many comments related to the 2015 draft guidance. As a result of these industry concerns, FDA has created the new draft guidance that this webinar addresses. The new draft guidance is titled Sponsor Responsibilities, Safety Reporting Requirements and Safety Assessment for IND and Bioavailability Bioequivalence Studies. We'll spend further time in this webinar detailing the content of this new draft guidance. Before discussing the new draft guidance, we'll briefly discuss the IND safety reporting rule. The final IND safety rule came into effect in March of 2011. You can find the rule at 21 CFR Part 312 and also Part 320. The rule codifies the requirements of sponsors conducting clinical trials under IND to report certain safety signals to FDA during the course of drug development. The requirements in the final rule were intended to improve the utility and quality of safety reports, expedite the strength and strengthen FDA's ability to review critical safety information, and better protect human subjects enrolled in clinical trials. As such, the rule codifies all of the requirements for expedited safety reporting under an IND and specifies when a sponsor has an obligation to submit either 15-day or 7-day safety reports. In an effort to promote clarity, the rule revised some of the definitions in use and introduced the term suspected adverse reaction, defining that term to mean that there is a reasonable possibility that the drug caused the adverse event. Further, the rule sought to better define reasonable possibility in the context of whether or not there is the reasonable possibility of a causal relationship between the drug and the observed adverse event. Ultimately, the rule defined reasonable possibility to mean that there is evidence to suggest a causal relationship between the drug and the adverse event. Finally, the rule sought to direct the reporting toward more interpretable findings in an effort to decrease submission of uninformative safety reports. As indicated previously, the first guidance published explaining the 2010 rule is the 2012 final guidance. It discusses IND safety reporting in depth and makes recommendations on unblinding and describes when and how to submit a safety report. The 2012 final guidance does not contain specific recommendations for unblinding of events requiring aggregate analysis. It also indicates that a sponsor should have in place a systemic approach for evaluating accumulating safety data and that they should monitor anticipated events at appropriate intervals. Although this 2012 guidance is currently the only final guidance related to IND safety reporting, you'll hear more in this webinar about how the new draft guidance incorporates the 2012 content while combining it with new recommendations and new content. That new content in the guidance that we've just released is generally derived as a response to comments that we received for the 2015 draft guidance. The 2015 guidance largely dealt with unblinding, safety assessment, aggregate analysis, and developing a safety surveillance plan. Because of this, the new guidance also focuses largely in these areas. Later, in the presentation, we will discuss the key updates to the 2015 guidance in these areas. Industry responded to the 2015 guidance and gave FDA valuable feedback, and we've listened. Here are some of the things that we've heard. Trial integrity challenges related to repeated unblinding. Trial complexity issues related to the interaction of the Safety Assessment Committee and the Data Monitoring Committee. Separating true safety signals from the background noise and the risk of over-reporting. The ability of the Data Monitoring Committee to function as the Safety Assessment Committee. As you can see, feedback from industry indicated challenges to implementing recommendations regarding trial integrity, trial complexity, and overlapping responsibilities, separating signal from the noise, and the need for the Safety Assessment Committee. FDA has responded to these concerns by creating the newly published draft guidance that is the topic of today's webinar. As you can see, the 2015 guidance is now withdrawn. The content of the 2015 guidance has been incorporated into the new draft guidance and modified based on industry input. The content from the 2012 final guidance is now included in this newly combined draft guidance. In an effort to highlight distinctions between sponsor and investigator responsibilities, the new draft guidance removes investigator responsibilities and instead focuses only on the sponsor. Please note that the content regarding investigator responsibilities is still available in the 2012 final guidance. As you can see from this graphic, FDA intends to create a standalone draft guidance that will focus on investigator responsibilities. Once the new draft guidance and the investigator draft guidance are finalized, they will replace the 2012 final guidance. Because the 2015 draft guidance has been withdrawn, these are the guidances that are currently related to investigator and sponsor responsibilities for IND safety reporting. The new draft guidance includes revitalized content from the 2012 draft guidance. The standalone investigator guidance will publish in the near future. Once this new draft guidance and the investigator's responsibility guidance are finalized, the current 2012 final guidance will be withdrawn. At that point, there will be two final guidances detailing IND safety reporting responsibilities. One will be targeted at the sponsor, and the other will focus solely on the investigator. Remember, until this new draft guidance and the investigator guidance is finalized, the 2012 final guidance remains in effect. Now that we've looked at the historical background of IND safety reporting and guidance, let's focus a bit on content. These next few slides will provide a brief overview of the IND safety reporting requirements as established by the 2010 final rule. The rule lays out the requirements for IND safety reporting to FDA by the sponsor found in 21 CFR 312.32. This portion of the rule covers the criteria for IND safety reporting and identifies both 7- and 15-day reports. Section 320.31d describes the provisions of safety reporting requirements for BA and BE studies. Section 312.64b lays out the reporting requirements of the investigator. Please be aware that investigator reporting requirements will be covered in a future guidance, and this webinar does not focus on investigator reporting requirements. In general, there are two time frames applicable to IND Safety Reports: those that are required to be submitted to FDA in 15 days, and those that are required to be submitted within 7 days. There are 5 categories of adverse events that trigger the sponsor's responsibility to submit an IND Safety Report, namely, serious and unexpected adverse reactions, findings from other studies suggesting a significant risk in humans, findings from animal and in vitro testing suggesting a significant risk in humans, an increased rate of occurrence of serious suspected adverse reactions, and serious adverse events from BA and BE studies not conducted under IND. IND safety reports must be submitted to FDA within 15 days of the adverse reaction, unless the adverse reaction was fatal or life-threatening. In such instances, the report must be submitted to FDA within 7 days. As noted in the last slide, 312.32 breaks out different categories that require an IND safety report. It may be helpful to group these categories into individual events and into those events requiring aggregate analysis. Serious and unexpected suspected adverse reactions are reportable as IND safety reports. Certain serious adverse events are informative as single cases because they are uncommon and are known to be strongly associated with drug exposure. The occurrence of even one case of such adverse events would meet the definition of suspected adverse reaction. Furthermore, a single occurrence, or more probably a small number of occurrences of a serious adverse event that is not commonly associated with drug exposure but is uncommon or even unlikely as a background event in the study population may also be informative. Besides these individual events, it could be that a serious and unexpected suspected adverse reaction is actually identified in the aggregate. For instance, such adverse reactions may be identified when an event occurs more frequently in a drug treatment group than in the control group. Sponsors are responsible for examining aggregate safety data overall and may be required to submit an IND safety report where such analysis reveals a finding that there is an increased rate of occurrence of serious expected adverse reactions. Finally, the sponsor must also report any findings from clinical, epidemiological, or pooled analysis of multiple studies or any findings from animal or in vitro testing that suggest a significant risk in humans exposed to the drug. As mentioned previously, the new draft guidance include changes in the recommendations based on feedback from the 2015 guidance. Next, we'll discuss the key updates in the new draft guidance for sponsors. In an effort to reduce uninformative IND safety reports, FDA continues to require that 3 criteria generally be met before a sponsor submits an IND safety report under this section. Namely, the event must be serious, unexpected, and there must be evidence to suggest a causal relationship between the drug and the event. The sponsor must assess whether or not there is a reasonable possibility that the drug caused the event. The sponsor should only submit such an IND safety report where all 3 criteria are met. One key area of interest has been aggregate reporting. The new draft guidance expands on the previous recommendations and recognizes that the method of aggregate review may vary based on the particular drug development program. Aggregate analysis is required to meet the sponsor's requirement to report events that are occurring more frequently in the drug treatment group and to also identify any increased rate of clinically important, serious, suspected adverse reactions occurring more frequently than anticipated by the protocol. Even non-statistically significant imbalances may be relevant. Sponsors must conduct evaluation of safety signals to include a detailed assessment of trial data. This webinar will give an overview of some of the related recommendations made in the new draft guidance. Aggregate review will be more likely to detect an imbalance when the sponsor has access to sufficient data and enrolled subjects. The guidance discusses variation among programs and discusses challenges for smaller programs. The guidance also addresses instances where aggregate analysis is appropriate and looks closely at interpretation of SAEs based on aggregate data. Aggregate analysis may be most useful in evaluating an increased rate of relatively common events. Throughout, the guidance recognizes industry concerns with implementation and recommends various approaches that may be appropriately tailored to the specific trial. As mentioned in the last slide, analysis of aggregate data to identify imbalances of adverse events will generally become more informative as drug development progresses and data accumulates. Unless differences are large, however, detection of a clinically meaningful imbalance often requires a database of significant size. Regardless of the size of the program, clinical judgment is crucial because imbalances of events between arms may simply result from chance. FDA recognizes that these determinations can be difficult and will require clinical judgment. Therefore, FDA will focus on the sponsor's process and reasoning regarding whether SAEs evaluated by analysis of aggregate data meets IND safety reporting criteria. The new draft guidance discusses two approaches that may be used to conduct aggregate analysis. The preferred approach is the unblinding trigger approach, or simply the trigger approach. In it, the sponsor prescribes predicted rates of anticipated SAEs. If the rate of the adverse events in the pooled treatment group substantially exceeds the predicted rate, then the sponsor should appropriately unblind and conduct aggregate analysis comparing each arm to determine if IND safety criteria are met. In the event that the sponsor cannot accurately predict the rates of anticipated SAEs, then they should use the analysis of all events by treatment group approach. This approach requires periodic aggregate analysis of SAEs and compares the numbers of SAEs across treatment arms to determine if there is a numerical imbalance that needs further evaluation to determine if IND safety reporting criteria are met. Sponsors should note that these approaches are not mutually exclusive. A sponsor may combine approaches for different events. For the trigger approach, sponsors must determine the rates of anticipated events. Sponsors should use all available data when determining rates of anticipated events. This may include placebo databases, historical data, literature, external epidemiological databases, electronic health records, and disease-specific registries to estimate rates of SAEs anticipated to occur in the study population. The predicted rates should be included in the plan for safety surveillance. The guidance recognizes and discusses the challenges in predicting rates of anticipated events. Accordingly, the rationale behind the choice of events for which a pre-specified threshold is identified is important, and the sponsor should document how that threshold is determined. The guidance discusses two specific methods of aggregate analysis. It discusses the trigger approach and the analysis of all events by treatment group. Aggregate analysis should generally be performed across multiple studies under the IND, and as appropriate across all INDs for the drug held by the sponsor, including both completed and ongoing trials. Clinical and statistical judgment is needed to evaluate the totality of the information related to a specific adverse event, including information from trials in different populations, particularly when the trials have different study designs, such as different dosing schedules, varying durations of follow-up, or different indications. FDA recognizes that these differences between studies may make it difficult to compare event rates across trials. Therefore, documentation of this clinical assessment is recommended. Appendix C of the new guidance is a flowchart detailing these two approaches to aggregate analysis. The flowchart is meant to show a simplified view of the approaches a sponsor should use depending on the specifics of the trial. Let's briefly walk through this flowchart. First, the sponsor should look at events requiring aggregate analysis. These often fall into two categories: serious adverse events anticipated to occur in the study population, and second, expected serious suspected adverse reactions. They should first ask, is it possible to identify the events up front and to accurately predict the rates for the events? If it is possible, then the sponsor should next calculate the overall rate of event across treatment groups. Next, the sponsor should ask if the overall rate of the event across treatment groups substantially exceeds the predicted rate. This is known as the unblinding trigger rate. If it does not, then the sponsor should continue monitoring as described in the plan for safety surveillance. On the other hand, if the overall rate of the event across treatment groups does substantially exceed the predicted rate, then the sponsor should proceed to analysis of all events by treatment group. Similarly, if it is not possible to identify the events up front and to accurately predict rates for the events, then the sponsor should proceed to analysis of all events by treatment group. The first step in this is to calculate rates of event by treatment group. Next, the sponsor should look at whether or not there is a numerical imbalance in event rates between or amongst the treatment arms. If there is, the sponsor should next ask, is the reporting threshold met? If the reporting threshold is met, then the sponsor must submit an IND Safety Report. If the reporting threshold is not met, then the sponsor should continue monitoring as described in the plan for safety surveillance. In all cases, the entity conducting the unblinded safety review should be firewalled from the staff conducting the trial and assessing efficacy. For the purposes of IND safety reporting, a suspected adverse reaction will meet the threshold if there is a reasonable possibility that the drug caused the event. In other words, there is evidence to suggest a causal relationship between the drug and the adverse event, as described in 312.32a. The new draft guidance describes reporting thresholds to interpret imbalances in aggregate data. To interpret these imbalances, clinical and statistical expertise may be needed to determine whether the totality of the available information meets the IND safety reporting criteria. The guidance lists the following factors to be considered when interpreting such imbalances in the aggregate. Some of these factors come from the 2015 guidance. However, as noted in this slide, many of them are new to this draft guidance. Please note that these are not new concepts for assessing causality. Rather, these concepts have been newly described in this guidance. If a data monitoring committee, or DMC, is in place, the DMC may be used to conduct aggregate analysis to help the sponsor assess whether the reporting criteria in cases of aggregate analysis have been met. The new guidance no longer refers to the entity assessing safety as the Safety Assessment Committee. Instead, the guidance provides input regarding flexible approaches to review aggregate safety information. The guidance indicates that the entity reviewing aggregate safety information should include an individual or individuals with knowledge about the investigational drug, the disease being treated, including the epidemiology of the disease, and the characteristics of the study population. These members should be qualified by training and experience to make clinical judgments about the safety of the drug. Identification of a new type of clinical safety concern may warrant adding additional expertise to the entity reviewing safety data. The roles and responsibilities of each individual or group of individuals in the entity should be clearly defined in the plan for safety surveillance. As mentioned in the last slide, the new draft guidance no longer specifically recommends the use of a safety assessment committee. Instead, the new draft guidance indicates that a sponsor may choose to designate an entity to review the accumulating safety information, to make a recommendation to the sponsor regarding whether the safety information meets the reporting requirements. It also allows flexibility in choosing this entity and discusses the necessary composition of the reviewing entity. Further, the new draft guidance acknowledges that a data monitoring committee, or DMC, may be used to conduct aggregate analysis. The new draft guidance discusses considerations for using a DMC to conduct review of aggregate data. It acknowledges that the DMC routinely sees unblinded data and can use existing controls for maintaining trial integrity. If a DMC is used for review, then the DMC charter should reflect this role. The new guidance addresses industry concerns regarding unblinding of safety data. The new guidance addresses when and how sponsors should unblind. The guidance no longer generally recommends regular unblinding for comparison of event rates as the preferred approach. As mentioned previously, the new guidance acknowledges that a trigger approach is acceptable and details FDA's recommendations for using this approach. Likewise, the guidance deals with unblinded analysis by treatment group in certain scenarios. Particularly, this approach may be useful where it is not possible to accurately predict rates of anticipated SAEs, or where events are not initially identified as anticipated. In the absence of a specific concern, FDA recommends that sponsors conduct aggregate analysis at intervals based on the volume of safety data collected or based upon subject accrual into the trial, or on event rates. It is likely that this review will happen at regular intervals, for example, 6 months, or more frequently as appropriate. The routine unblinding of SAEs that occurs with analysis of all events by treatment group requires scrupulous, thoroughly planned, and well-documented efforts to protect data integrity, assuring that the entity carrying out the review is completely firewalled from the staff conducting the trial and assessing efficacy. Prospective development of a safety surveillance plan for assessing SAEs, particularly those SAEs that are only interpretable in the aggregate and other important safety information, is a critical component of IND safety reporting. The plan, also referred to as a safety monitoring plan, should describe processes and procedures for assessing SAEs and other important safety information in a drug development program. The new guidance includes elements that should be included in the plan for safety surveillance. It also specifies that the plan should be maintained by the sponsor and must be available for FDA inspection. Sponsors may discuss the anticipated SAEs with the applicable FDA review division during protocol development and prior to trial initiation as appropriate. The sponsor should evaluate the safety surveillance plan as the development program progresses and the safety profile of the product evolves to determine whether the plan should be updated. The plan should be maintained by the sponsor and must be available for FDA inspection as required under 312.58a. The new guidance expands on FDA's recommendations in the 2012 guidance regarding safety reporting for marketed drugs and active controls. If the study under IND has an active control group, but the sponsor is not the NDA or BLA holder for the control drug, serious and unexpected adverse events in the control group that can be assessed as suspected adverse reactions based on an individual or small number of events must be reported to the IND as individual events. If the sponsor is also the NDA or BLA holder for the control drug, the serious and unexpected suspected adverse reaction must also be submitted as required under post-marketing regulations. If the sponsor is not the NDA or BLA holder, then the sponsor should consider sharing events that suggest a higher rate with the active control group with the NDA or BLA holder, even if they do not rise to the level of IND safety reporting. The new guidance is not the sole source of information related to streamlining electronic reporting of IND safety reports. However, it does provide a brief synopsis of electronic reporting and refers the reader to the 2019 guidances related to the electronic submission of IND safety reports. FDA has begun to implement a new process for electronic submission of IND safety reports. The old process for submitting IND safety reports was inefficient and lacked the ability for FDA to universally track reports. Additionally, it came to FDA as unstructured data. As such, FDA could not readily leverage the data for greater analysis. The new process will give FDA access to structured data. As such, it will allow FDA to use analytic tools for review and tracking of safety data. The new guidance introduces the process for submitting IND safety reports electronically. FDA encourages electronic submission of IND safety reports to FAERS. FDA provides two methods for electronically submitting safety reports. Specifically, the Electronic Submissions Gateway or the Safety Reporting Portal may be used. Submitting electronically will allow FDA to receive structured data. Structured data elements will improve the FDA's ability to review and track the safety signals that occur during the conduct of clinical trials. Because of this, FDA highly encourages sponsors to submit IND safety reports to FAERS as soon as the new submission process is available. FDA will soon announce when sponsors can begin to voluntarily submit IND safety reports to FAERS. Although the new guidance addresses electronic submission of IND safety reports, it does not fully explain the process or the requirements. Listed here are the additional guidances and references detailing the process of electronic submission of IND safety reports in greater depth. Be sure to see these helpful resources for further information on this topic. In addition to the flowchart that we shared earlier in this presentation, the new draft guidance includes 3 other flowcharts that seek to simplify complex IND safety reporting subjects. Before we conclude this webinar, I'd like to walk through one of these flowcharts that I think you may find useful in determining if an adverse event meets criteria for safety reporting. Appendix A, seen here, is a flowchart illustrating whether an adverse event meets criteria for IND safety reporting. In addition to walking through the process for determining whether or not an event meets criteria, it also includes relevant links to the Code of Federal Regulations. Now, let's briefly walk through it together. First, a sponsor should look at whether or not the adverse event was serious, as assessed by either the investigator or the sponsor. If the event was not serious, then the sponsor should include the adverse event in an annual report or an information amendment to the IND. On the other hand, if the adverse event is serious, the sponsor should ask, is the serious adverse event unexpected as assessed by the sponsor? If the event is not unexpected, then the sponsor must next ask, does the expected serious adverse event indicate a clinically important increase in the rate of a serious suspected adverse reaction over that listed in the protocol or investigator's brochure? If it does, then the sponsor must submit an IND safety report. If it does not, then the sponsor must include the serious adverse event in an annual report or an information amendment to the IND. Going back to this initial line of questioning, if the sponsor has determined that the adverse event is serious and unexpected, they should next ask, is there a reasonable possibility that the drug caused the serious adverse event, as assessed by the sponsor? Examples of evidence suggesting a causal relationship between the drug and the serious adverse event include a single occurrence of an event that is uncommon and known to be strongly associated with drug exposure, one or more occurrences of an event that is not commonly associated with drug exposure but is otherwise uncommon in the population exposed to the drug, and an aggregate analysis of specific events observed in a clinical trial, such as known consequences of the underlying disease or condition under investigation or other events that commonly occur in the study population independent of drug exposure, that indicates those events occur more frequently in the drug treatment group than in a concurrent or historical control group. If the answer is yes, that there is a reasonable possibility that the drug caused the serious adverse event, then the sponsor must file an IND safety report. If not, then the sponsor must include the serious adverse event in an annual report or an information amendment to the IND as appropriate. We hope that you'll enjoy the user-friendly nature of the flowcharts in the new guidance. I encourage you to read the guidance in its entirety. Although this training covered some of the key concepts of the guidance, this training was not meant to be exhaustive. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, you may submit comments on the draft guidance. The comments may be submitted electronically through the Federal e-rulemaking portal, which can be found at www.regulations.gov. You may also submit written comments to the documents management staff at FDA. More information on submitting comments can be found in the Notice of Availability for this draft guidance. For additional resources on IND safety reporting, please visit FDA's webpage for IND safety reporting website. If you have additional questions, please send an email to CDER's Office of Medical Policy by using the email or telephone information provided here. We look forward to your comments. Thank you for your time and for your attention.